Wind howled across frozen peaks, driving snow into every open crack. Bitter frost claimed land, freezing rivers solid. Deep within this icy hell, one man sat in absolute comfort. 87 degrees, sweating even. He required no firewood, no matches, no heavy coats. Just pure, ancient geothermal engineering, mixed with desperate ingenuity. Caleb Hayes had vanished into Montana's brutal wilderness months ago, presumed dead by search parties and his own family. Everyone thought winter swallowed his life. They were wrong. Caleb built a sanctuary beneath solid rock, surviving against impossible odds. His secret could change everything. Caleb Hayes did not venture into the Bitterroot Mountains to die. He went there to disappear. At 42, his life as a structural engineer in Seattle had violently unraveled. It started with a catastrophic commercial project, a high-rise where his firm's lead architect, Richard Sterling, cut corners on materials. When the retaining walls failed, Richard managed to pin the negligence entirely on Caleb. The ensuing legal battle drained Caleb's bank accounts. 2 months later, his wife, Sarah, packed her bags, leaving nothing but a sterile note on the kitchen island. Bereft of his career, his reputation, and his marriage, Caleb liquidated his remaining assets, bought $3,000 worth of extreme cold-weather gear, and drove to Montana. He wanted isolation. He wanted the punishing silence of the wild. He spent October building a modest A-frame cabin off the grid, miles away from the nearest logging road, deep in a nameless valley flanked by towering granite peaks. For a few weeks, he found a bitter sort of peace. Then came the second week of November. Meteorologists down in Missoula called it a freak weather event, a pressure system that dragged Arctic air down from Canada with unprecedented ferocity. For Caleb, it was simply the end of the world. The snow did not fall. It fired from the sky sideways, driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero in a matter of hours. Caleb had been outside, chopping the last of his deadwood, when he heard the sound. It wasn't a roar. It was a deep, guttural crack that vibrated in his molars. He looked up the slope. The entire face of the mountain seemed to detach. A massive shelf of snow, ice, and uprooted pine trees was rushing toward him at highway speeds. He dropped his axe and sprinted. He didn't make for the cabin he knew the timber wouldn't hold. He dove toward a massive granite, outcropping 50 yards away, scrambling behind its leeward side just as the world went white. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure that squeezed the air from his lungs. The avalanche obliterated his A-frame, snapping the heavy timber like dry twigs, burying his food, his sleeping bags, and his radio beneath 20 feet of compacted ice. When the roar finally subsided, Caleb crawled out from the snowdrift. The landscape was unrecognizable. His shelter was gone. His supplies were gone. All he possessed was what he carried: his layered clothing, a tactical day pack containing a folding titanium shovel, a fixed-blade knife, a magnesium fire starter, an emergency thermal blanket, and a half-empty steel canteen. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. He was a dead man. No one knew exactly where he was. Arthur Pendleton, the old hardware store owner in the valley town, knew he was up the ridge. But search and rescue helicopters couldn't fly in this blizzard, and even if they could, there was nothing left to see. The wind began to howl again, biting through his insulated jacket. Hypothermia is a stealthy executioner. First comes the shivering, violent, and uncontrollable. Then comes the apathy, the sluggishness, the irresistible urge to just sit down and rest. Caleb knew the symptoms. He forced his legs to move, wading through waist-deep powder. He had to find shelter before nightfall, or his blood would literally turn to slush. For 3 hours, he trudged blindly along the base of the granite cliffs, the wind stealing his body heat faster than he could generate it. His fingers inside his heavy gloves grew numb. His vision tunneled. He was stumbling, tripping over hidden rocks, his mind playing tricks on him. He thought he heard Sarah calling his name over the shrieking wind. "Just close your eyes, Caleb," a voice whispered in his mind. Just for a minute. He collapsed against a sheer rock wall, sliding down into the snow. As his head hit the stone, a strange sensation washed over him. The wind was hitting his face, but right behind his neck, there was a void. No wind. Just dead. Still air. He forced his heavy eyelids open and turned his head. Hidden behind a jagged curtain of fallen boulders was a fissure in the cliff face. It was narrow, barely 3 feet wide, vanishing into absolute darkness. It looked like the gaping maw of a beast. With the last of his adrenaline, Caleb crawled forward, dragging his body over the loose scree and into the throat of the mountain. The moment he crossed the threshold, the deafening roar of the blizzard was muted, reduced to a low moan. It was still freezing inside, but the lethal wind chill was gone. He fumbled in his pack with wooden fingers, pulling out a green chemical glow stick. He cracked it. The eerie emerald light illuminated a narrow limestone tunnel sloping downward. It wasn't a shallow cave. It went deep into the earth. Caleb wrapped his thermal blanket around his shivering shoulders and began to walk down into the dark, unaware that he was stepping into a geological anomaly that would both save his life and test his sanity. The deeper Caleb descended, the more the cave expanded. The narrow tunnel gave way to a wider cavern, its ceiling dripping with ancient stalactites. The green glow stick cast long, monstrous shadows against the damp walls. He walked for what felt like a mile, his boots crunching on loose gravel. As the adrenaline wore off, the brutal reality of the cold returned. The ambient temperature in the cave was hovering around 30 degrees. It was survivable for a few hours, but without a fire, his core temperature would eventually drop, and there was absolutely nothing to burn. The cave was devoid of organic material. No dry brush, no bat guano, just wet stone. But then, Caleb noticed something impossible. He stopped and stripped off his right glove. He held his bare hand out in the darkness. A breeze was moving against his palm, but it wasn't cold air rushing in from the storm outside. It was a draft coming from below, and it was warm. He hurried forward, following the draft. The tunnel narrowed again, forcing him onto his hands and knees. As he crawled, the air grew noticeably warmer. 40 degrees, 50 degrees, but with the warmth came a smell. A foul, pungent odor of rotten eggs that stung his nostrils and made his eyes water. Hydrogen sulfide. Caleb emerged onto a rocky ledge, overlooking a sunken chamber. At the bottom of the chamber, illuminated by the fading green light of his glow stick, was a pool of water. It was bubbling violently. Steam rose from the surface in thick, swirling clouds. He had found a geothermal hot spring. The bitter roots were known for them, fueled by magma chambers deep within the Earth's crust. He scrambled down the ledge, stripping off his heavy jacket as the temperature spiked. Down by the pool, it was easily 90 degrees. He laughed, a hoarse, ragged sound of sheer relief. He was saved. He wouldn't freeze to death. He sat by the edge of the boiling pool, letting the intense heat soak into his chilled bones. He closed his eyes, savoring the feeling of his blood vessels expanding, his muscles unwinding. 30 minutes later, the headache started. It began as a dull throb behind his temples, quickly escalating into a blinding spike of pain. His stomach churned. He opened his eyes, but his vision was blurred, the green light splitting into double images. His chest felt tight, his lungs burning with every breath. The gas, the hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide venting from the spring, were trapped in the lower chamber. Without adequate ventilation, the toxic gases were displacing the oxygen. The heat that was saving him from the cold was simultaneously suffocating him. Panic seized him. He tried to stand, but his legs turned to rubber. He fell to his hands and knees, gasping for clean air. The rotten egg smell had seemingly vanished, a classic fatal sign of olfactory fatigue caused by high levels of hydrogen sulfide. His brain was shutting down. Caleb clawed his way up the rocky incline, dragging himself away from the pool. He scrambled back into the narrow, colder tunnel, collapsing onto the freezing gravel. He lay there for an hour, taking deep, ragged breaths of the cold, clean air, until the pounding in his head subsided. He sat up, the reality of his situation settling over him like a lead weight. Down by the water, he would die of asphyxiation. Up here in the tunnel, he would die of hypothermia. He was trapped between fire and ice. Caleb leaned back against the cave wall and closed his eyes. He wasn't just a man waiting to die anymore. He was a structural engineer. He understood airflow, thermal mass, and fluid dynamics. If he couldn't survive in the heat, he had to bring the heat to him, and leave the poison behind. He needed to build a hypocaust. It was an ancient Roman heating system. The Romans used to build raised floors, allowing hot gases from a furnace to circulate beneath the floorboards, heating the stone from below while venting the toxic smoke outside. Caleb didn't have a furnace, but he had a boiling volcanic vent. He activated his flashlight, a crank-powered LED, and began to scour the cavern. Halfway between the freezing entrance and the toxic hot spring, he found a natural bottleneck in the tunnel, a flat area roughly 10 feet by 10 feet. This would be his living quarters. Next, he needed materials. He spent the next 48 hours in an agonizing cycle of labor and retreat. He would hold his breath, sprint down into the toxic heat of the spring, grab as many flat slabs of shale as he could carry, and run back up to the cold zone before he passed out. His hands were soon torn and bleeding, his fingernails cracked from prying stones from the earth. Using his titanium shovel, he dug a trench through the center of his designated living area, angling it down toward the hot spring. This would be the main conduit for the hot air. But how to pull the heat up without the gas pooling in his shelter? He noticed a secondary, vertical fissure in the ceiling of his new room, acting like a natural chimney. Hot air rises. If he could create a sealed channel from the spring, under his floor, and up into the ceiling vent, the natural draft would pull the hot, toxic air under him and away from him. He built a raised floor over the trench, using the large slabs of shale, supporting them with stacked rocks. To seal the gaps between the stones, he needed mortar. He found thick, heavy clay near the edge of the boiling pool. Hauling the clay up bucket by bucket, using his waterproof pack liner, he smeared it over the shale floor, pressing it into every crack and crevice. He was starving. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. He was drinking water from a cold drip near the entrance, his body running entirely on the cannibalization of his own fat reserves. He worked in a fugue state, driven by sheer, animal desperation. He built a low wall across the tunnel, opening leading to the spring, leaving only the trench open at the bottom to funnel the hot air. He sealed the wall with clay and packed rocks. Finally, on the 4th day, the system was complete. He stood back, his clothes caked in dried gray clay, his body trembling with exhaustion. Now, he had to see if he would live or freeze. Caleb sat cross-legged on the thick clay and shale floor. He waited. At first, nothing happened. The stone remained icy to the touch. Doubt, cold and insidious, crept into his mind. Maybe the draft wasn't strong enough. Maybe the clay seal was too thick. Maybe Richard Sterling was right about him. Maybe he really was a failure who couldn't design a functional structure to save his life. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, the floor began to change. The heat from the volcanic vent, naturally rising, was caught by the low wall he had built and forced into the trench beneath his floor. The thermal mass of the shale began to absorb the heat. Caleb placed his bare palm flat against the stone. It wasn't freezing anymore. It was tepid. An hour later, it was warm. 2 hours later, it was radiating heat like a massive oven. Caleb unzipped his heavy jacket. The ambient temperature in the cavern was rising. The toxic hydrogen sulfide was being pulled beneath the sealed floor and drafted perfectly up into the vertical chimney in the ceiling, leaving the air in his living space fresh and breathable. The engineering was flawless. He unstrapped his digital altimeter watch, which had a built-in thermometer. He set it on the floor and watched the digital numbers climb. 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It finally stopped and held steady at a staggering 87 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, a deadly blizzard was raging, plunging the mountains into 30 degrees below zero. Inside, Caleb was stripping down to his moisture-wicking base layers, wiping sweat from his forehead. He had built a fortress of absolute warmth. He didn't need to chop a single piece of firewood. The earth itself was his furnace, burning eternally, requiring no maintenance. But warmth was only one pillar of survival. As the intense heat baked his muscles, his stomach let out a hollow, agonizing growl. The human body burns calories just to exist. In 87 degrees, he wasn't burning calories to stay warm, but he was slowly starving to death. He had to find food. Leaving the cave was suicide. The storm was still raging outside. He began to explore the deeper, safer offshoots of the cavern system. Places where the air was clean, and the temperature a mild 60 degrees. In the damp, dark corners, he found life. Pale, fleshy mushrooms grew on the walls where water seeped through the limestone. He had taken a mycology course in college. They resembled Pleurotus austratus oyster mushrooms. It was a gamble. If they were toxic, he would die a miserable, cramping death in the dark. He ate them raw. They tasted like dirt and damp wood, but they stayed down. The next day, a small miracle occurred. The warmth of the cave's entrance acted as a beacon in the frozen wasteland. Animals, desperate for shelter from the killing freeze, were drawn to the fissure. Caleb fashioned a crude deadfall trap using a heavy rock and a trigger stick carved with his knife, baiting it with a piece of mushroom. Within hours, he heard a sharp clack. He hurried to the entrance and found a large snowshoe hare pinned beneath the stone. Using his knife, he skinned and cleaned the animal. He had no fire to cook it, but he had the boiling spring. Holding his breath, he descended into the toxic zone, submerged the meat in the 200-degree water, and boiled it until it was fully cooked. He was surviving. He had shelter, limitless heat, water, and a trickle of food. But as the weeks dragged on, the psychological toll of the dark began to fracture his mind. He lived in eternal twilight, lit only by his crank flashlight. The relentless heat of the floor baked the air bone dry. The silence of the cave was deafening, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic bubbling of the hot spring. He started talking to Sarah. He would sit on his 7-degree floor, carving notches into a piece of wood to track the days, and explain his engineering choices to his absent wife. "You see, Sarah," he muttered, his voice echoing off the limestone. "The thermal conductivity of the shale is key. It retains the heat. I bet Richard couldn't build this. Richard would have suffocated on the first day." On day 42, Caleb was exploring a far, narrow branch of the cave, looking for more fungal blooms. He was crawling on his belly through a tight squeeze when his flashlight beam caught something unnatural. It wasn't a rock. It was a piece of milled timber. Caleb froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pushed himself forward, emerging into a small, dry chamber. Dust hung thick in the air. In the center of the room lay the remains of a small, rudimentary camp. There was a rusted pickaxe leaning against the wall, its wooden handle petrified with age, a shattered kerosene lantern, and beneath a heavy wool blanket that had turned to gray dust, a human skeleton. Caleb backed away, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't the first person to find this cave. He approached the remains with trembling hands. Beside the skeletal fingers lay a small leather-bound book. The leather was dried and cracked, but the pages inside were remarkably preserved by the dry, stable air of the chamber. Caleb opened it. The handwriting was elegant, written in faded fountain pen ink. December 12th, 1898. The first legible entry read, "My name is Jebediah Cole. I have struck silver in the upper ridge, but the winter has trapped me. The storm came too fast. I have taken refuge in this devil's hole. The heat from the water below keeps me alive, but I fear it is changing the rock." Caleb flipped through the pages. Jebediah had survived for months, much like Caleb, eating roots and trapping small game. But the later entries grew frantic, the handwriting chaotic. March 3rd. The mountain groans. It is not just the wind, the heat from the devil's pool. It is eating the pillars. The stone is turning to chalk. I heard a collapse in the lower tunnels today. The water is getting hotter. The earth is boiling away its own bones. Caleb stared at the words, a cold dread pooling in his stomach despite the sweltering heat of his shelter. He remembered the crumbling limestone near the spring. The highly acidic hydrogen sulfide gas, mixed with the steam, creates sulfuric acid. Over decades, centuries, the acid eats away at the limestone, creating massive underground voids. Jebediah Cole hadn't starved. The final entry was a single, hurried line. "The floor is dropping. May God have M0.com. Caleb snapped the journal shut. A sudden, terrifying realization hit him. He had built his heavy rock floor directly over a hollowed-out trench. He was sleeping above a massive, expanding void of boiling water and acid gas. Before the thought could fully crystallize, a sound ripped through the silence of the cave. It wasn't the howling wind. It was a deep, resonant crack, that vibrated through the soles of Caleb's boots. The floor beneath his feet violently shifted. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in a blinding curtain. The temperature gauge on his watch spiked to 92 degrees Fahrenheit. The mountain was moving. The cavern floor did not just shift, it shuddered with the violence of a derailed freight train. Caleb threw himself backward, abandoning the skeletal remains of Jebediah Cole and the leather-bound journal. He scrambled on hands and knees across the loose gravel, tearing the skin from his palms as he scrambled toward the safety of the main tunnel. Behind him, the sound of tearing rock echoed like artillery fire. A massive slab of limestone, weakened by a century of acidic vapor, detached from the ceiling of the adjacent chamber and slammed into the floor. A thick cloud of pulverized gray dust billowed out, choking the air. Caleb hit the ground, covering his mouth and nose with the collar of his base layer, his heart hammering against his ribs in a chaotic rhythm. When the dust finally began to settle, he crawled cautiously back to the threshold of his living quarters. The sight made his stomach drop. His hypocaust system, the brilliantly engineered raised floor that had kept him alive at a sweltering 87 degrees, was fractured. The trench he had dug to funnel the hot air had collapsed inward on its left flank. The heavy shale slabs he had painstakingly hauled from the hot spring were tilting dangerously, the clay mortar cracking along the seams. Worse, the protective barrier he had built to keep the toxic hydrogen sulfide gas trapped in the lower draft was compromised. A faint, sickeningly sweet odor of rotten eggs was already beginning to seep into the room. Caleb pulled his altimeter watch from the dust. The digital display blinked, 94 degrees Fahrenheit. The geothermal activity beneath the mountain was surging. The magma chamber deep within the Earth's crust was pushing more heat, more steam, and more acid upward. The sanctuary that had saved him from the Arctic winter was rapidly turning into an oven, and soon it would become a gas chamber. Think, Caleb. Think like an engineer. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing down the rising tide of panic. This was exactly what had happened in Seattle. A foundation had shifted, a retaining wall had failed, and he had frozen. He had let Richard Sterling take control of the narrative, let him patch the problem with substandard materials until the whole structure came down. He would not freeze this time. There was no one else to blame, no corporate lawyers to hide behind. It was just him, the rock, and the immutable laws of physics. He grabbed his crank-powered LED flashlight and gave it 50 aggressive turns, the whining of the dynamo slicing through the heavy silence of the cave. He cast the beam over the fractured floor. The structural integrity was failing because the limestone bedrock beneath his trench was calcifying and turning to powder from the acidic steam. He needed to shore up the floor, and he needed to do it before the gas concentration reached lethal levels. Caleb sprinted back to the dry chamber, where he had found Jebediah Cole. He muttered a quiet, breathless apology to the century-old bones as he snatched the rusted pickaxe from the wall. The wooden handle was dry-rotted, splintering instantly against his grip, but the heavy iron head was still intact. He also grabbed a length of old, heavy-duty mining chain he spotted half-buried under the dust near Jebediah's boot. Back in his sweltering living quarters, the temperature had climbed to 96 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat poured off Caleb in sheets, stinging his eyes and turning the dust on his skin into a thick, gray paste. He tied his spare shirt around his face to filter the sulfurous air and went to work. Using the iron head of the pickaxe as a wedge and a heavy piece of granite as a makeshift sledgehammer, Caleb began to meticulously dismantle the collapsed section of his floor. Every time he moved a slab, a localized pocket of trapped, blistering steam vented upward, scalding his forearms. His skin blistered red, but he couldn't stop. He realized he couldn't rely on the soft limestone anymore. He needed a stronger foundation. He dragged the heavy iron chain across the trench, anchoring it between two massive, solid stalagmites on either side of the room. He tensioned the chain using a tourniquet method with a thick piece of petrified wood, creating a rigid, iron crossbeam suspended over the void. Next, he scavenged the hardest rock he could find, igneous basalt, from a deeper vein he had spotted days ago. It took him 14 agonizing trips, his muscles screaming under the weight, to haul enough basalt boulders to rebuild the collapsed wall of the trench. He used the tension chain to support the heaviest central slab, taking the weight off the crumbling limestone edges. To seal the lethal gas away once more, he needed a stronger mortar. The clay alone was drying out and cracking in the extreme heat. Caleb remembered a trick from his university chemistry classes. Mixing clay with wood ash creates a primitive, highly durable cement. He had no wood, but he had bones. He returned to Jebediah's camp. He didn't touch the human remains. Some line of sanity still held firm in his mind, but he gathered the scattered, calcified bones of whatever animals the old miner had trapped 100 years ago. Using his titanium shovel, Caleb ground the ancient bones into a fine white powder. He mixed this bone ash with the wet clay near the hot spring, creating a thick, sticky paste. He slathered the bone mortar over the cracks in his newly reinforced floor, pressing it deep into the fissures. The heat of the trench immediately began to bake the mixture, hardening it into a shell that felt like concrete. 9 hours later, he collapsed against the cool wall of the upper tunnel, gasping for clean air. He watched the digital readout on his watch. The temperature slowly dropped, stabilizing at 89 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of rotten eggs faded. The iron chain held. The bone mortar held. Caleb looked at his blistered, bleeding hands. He had beaten the mountain. But as he lay there in the dark, his stomach let out a violent, hollow cramp. He had burned thousands of calories in the sweltering heat. The deadfall traps at the entrance had been empty for a week. The mountain was trying to cook him, and if it failed, it was perfectly content to let him starve. By late January, time lost all meaning. The notches carved into the piece of petrified wood numbered 72, but Caleb could no longer trust his own counting. The eternal twilight of the cave had completely dismantled his circadian rhythm. He slept when exhaustion took him, often waking in a cold sweat on his 8-9 degree floor, unsure if he had slept for 10 minutes or 10 hours. The physical deterioration was alarming. His ribcage protruded sharply against his pale skin. His belt was cinched to the last hole, and his heavy winter trousers hung off him like loose sails. The oyster mushrooms growing in the damp offshoots of the cave provided barely enough sustenance to keep his organs functioning, and the snowshoe hares had seemingly vanished, likely driven deeper into the valleys by the relentless blizzard that still howled beyond the entrance fissure. Hunger wasn't just a physical pain anymore. It was a loud, intrusive voice in his head. It made him irritable. It made him hallucinate. He began seeing Sarah standing at the edge of the shadows, her arms crossed, wearing that same look of profound disappointment she had worn the day she left. "You built a very warm tomb, Caleb," the hallucination of his wife whispered, her voice echoing off the dripping stalactites. "But it's still a tomb." "It's a marvel of improvised engineering," Caleb snapped back aloud, his voice raspy and thin. "I stabilized the lateral load. Richard couldn't have done that." "Richard is eating a steak in downtown Seattle," she replied, fading into the gloom. "You are eating fungus." Caleb threw a handful of gravel at the shadow, the stones clattering harmlessly against the cave wall. He needed a distraction before he lost his mind completely. He retreated to his living quarters, the heat wrapping around him like a heavy, dry blanket. He picked up Jebediah Cole's journal. He had read the grim entries of the miner's final days dozens of times. But now, fueled by a desperate need for a way out, he began to study the back pages of the book. Between pages stained with a century of mold and dried sweat, Caleb found a folded piece of heavy parchment. He opened it carefully, afraid it would disintegrate. It was a map. Jebediah had not just been sitting by the hot spring waiting to die. He had been exploring. The map detailed the lower chambers, the location of the toxic pool labeled the Devil's Spit, and the main tunnel leading to the entrance. But there was something else. A dotted line branched off from the main tunnel, winding sharply upward, spiraling higher into the mountain rock. At the top of the dotted line, Jebediah had drawn a small circle and written, "The High Chimney. Draft blows cold." Blocked by deadfall, Caleb stared at the words. Draft blows cold. If there was a cold draft, it meant there was a second opening to the surface, an upper exit. If the blizzard ever broke, or if the lower entrance was buried by another avalanche, that chimney could be his only way out. Furthermore, if he could unblock it, the massive influx of cold air would drastically improve the ventilation of the entire cave system, pushing the creeping toxicity of the hot spring down and away permanently. He had to find it. He packed his tactical daypack with his titanium shovel, his knife, his fire starter, and his emergency blanket. He drank deeply from the cold condensation drips near the entrance, filling his canteen, and set off into the uncharted darkness, following Jebediah's century-old map. The journey was treacherous. The dotted line on the map corresponded to a narrow, jagged fissure that climbed at a punishing 45-degree angle. The air here was damp and biting cold, a stark contrast to his heated sanctuary. The limestone was slick with moisture, forcing Caleb to wedge himself between the walls and inch his way upward, using his back and his boots to shimmy against the rock. Every muscle fiber burned. His starved body protested every movement, his heart hammering weakly against his ribs. After 3 hours of climbing, the fissure widened, depositing him onto a wide, flat ledge overlooking a massive, echoing chasm. He cranked his flashlight, shining the beam into the void. The light simply swallowed it. He tossed a small rock over the edge. He waited 3 full seconds before he heard it strike bottom. A 30-foot drop. Fatal. According to Jebediah's map, the path continued on the other side of the chasm, roughly 10 feet away. There was no natural bridge, but there was a narrow shelf, barely 6 inches wide, running along the left wall of the cavern, connecting the 2 sides. Just a lateral beam transfer, Caleb muttered to himself, treating the terrifying precipice like a structural engineering problem. Keep the center of gravity low. 3 points of contact. He pressed his back flat against the wet limestone wall and shuffled his right boot onto the 6-inch shelf. He spread his arms wide, his raw, blistered fingers finding microscopic purchase in the rock face. He didn't look down. He stared straight ahead at the opposite ledge. He moved inches at a time. The cold air rushing up from the chasm chilled him to the bone, a sharp reminder of the brutal world outside his heated floor. Halfway across, his left boot slipped on a patch of black ice, formed by the subterranean draft. Caleb dropped. Instinct took over. His hands clawed desperately at the wall, his fingernails tearing. His right arm caught a jagged outcropping of rock, his shoulder socket popping agonizingly as it took his entire body weight. He swung wildly over the abyss, his legs kicking at empty air. A ragged scream tore from his throat as the pain in his shoulder flared like white-hot fire. He hung there, dangling over a 30-foot drop, 100 feet beneath the surface of the earth, entirely alone. He gritted his teeth, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. Using every ounce of his remaining strength, he swung his momentum backward, slamming his boots against the rock face. He found the narrow shelf again. Panting, shaking violently, he dragged himself the rest of the way across the shelf and collapsed onto the far ledge. He lay in the dark, clutching his throbbing shoulder, realizing with absolute clarity that if he died up here, he wouldn't even have the comfort of an 8-9-degree grave. It took Caleb another hour to gather the strength to stand. His right shoulder wasn't dislocated, but the rotator cuff was severely strained. A dull, grinding pain radiated down his arm with every movement. He swallowed 2 ibuprofen tablets from his diminishing first aid kit, a pathetic defense against the agony, and pressed forward. The tunnel sloped sharply upward now. The air grew significantly colder, plunging back down into the 20s. Frost coated the walls, glittering like diamonds in the beam of his flashlight. He was getting close to the surface. Finally, the tunnel dead-ended in a massive, vertical shaft. The high chimney. Caleb looked up. The shaft was roughly 10 feet wide, going straight up into the darkness. But 30 feet above him, the shaft was choked with a chaotic mass of massive boulders, splintered pine trunks, and centuries of compacted ice. Jebediah's deadfall, a landslide or avalanche from 100 years ago, had permanently sealed this exit. However, Jebediah was right about the draft. A fierce, freezing wind whistled through the microscopic cracks in the debris plug, biting at Caleb's sweat-soaked clothes. The air up here was pure and oxygen-rich. If he could clear that plug, he would have a secondary exit and perfect ventilation. But looking at the massive boulders suspended in the ice, Caleb knew his titanium folding shovel was useless. It would take heavy explosives to clear that shaft. It was a dead end. Defeated, exhausted, and shivering violently in the freezing draft, Caleb turned to begin the agonizing descent back to his warm shelter. That was when he smelled it. Even up here, hundreds of feet away from the geothermal spring, the sudden, overwhelming stench of rotten eggs punched him in the face. It wasn't a slow seep, it was a wall of odor. He heard a sound rumbling up from the depths of the mountain. It sounded like a massive jet engine spooling up, a deep, vibrational roar that shook the frost from the ceiling. The devil's spit. The geothermal spring wasn't just surging anymore, it was erupting. A pocket of superheated water and compressed gas trapped beneath the magma chamber had suddenly released. Caleb scrambled to the edge of the ledge overlooking the dark tunnel he had just climbed through. He saw it before the heat hit him. A thick, rolling cloud of dense, white vapor was rushing up the tunnel at terrifying speed. It looked like a living entity, swallowing the darkness. The steam hit him a second later. It wasn't just hot water vapor. It was highly concentrated, aerosolized sulfuric acid mixed with boiling steam. The temperature in the freezing upper chamber spiked from 20 degrees to 110 degrees in a matter of seconds. Caleb fell backward, gasping. The air burned his throat like swallowed fire. His eyes watered instantly, the acidic vapor stinging his corneas. He looked at his jacket. The synthetic nylon was beginning to pit and melt, small holes appearing as the acidic condensation settled on the fabric. The steam was hitting the freezing ceiling of the high chimney, rapidly condensing, and raining back down upon him in scalding toxic drops. Acid rain. The mountain was raining acid inside itself. Panic, primal and absolute, overrode his exhaustion. He couldn't go down. The main tunnel was a pipe filled with boiling poison. He was trapped in the upper chamber, and he was being cooked and dissolved simultaneously. He dragged himself into a small, shallow alcove carved into the side of the chimney wall, desperately trying to escape the direct downpour of the acid rain. He tore the heavy thermal emergency blanket from his pack. The mylar material was highly resistant to chemical corrosion and heat, and threw it over his head, pulling his knees to his chest to create a tiny, silver tent. Inside the mylar, the heat was suffocating. His altimeter watch, strapped to his wrist, beeped a frantic warning. 118 degrees Fahrenheit. 125 degrees Fahrenheit. He was trapped in a pressure cooker. The roar of the venting steam outside his blanket was deafening. He pressed his face against his knees, breathing in shallow, rapid gasps, trying to conserve whatever clean oxygen was trapped beneath his silver shroud. This is it, he thought, his mind beginning to drift as the hyperthermia set in. The foundation failed. The structure is coming down. He closed his eyes, expecting to see Sarah again, expecting to see the snow falling in Seattle, but instead, his mind, disciplined by years of rigid structural analysis, snapped back to the present. He felt the rock beneath him, the ledge. He remembered the layout of the chimney. Hot air rises, steam rises. The freezing air from the micro cracks in the ceiling plug was pushing down. There had to be a thermal boundary layer, a zone where the rising boiling steam met the descending freezing air. If he stayed on the floor of the ledge, he was bathing in the densest part of the rolling steam cloud as it banked off the walls. But if he climbed higher, closer to the ice plug, Caleb threw off the mylar blanket. The acidic steam bit into his exposed face immediately, blistering his cheek. He didn't scream. He didn't have the breath. He grabbed the rugged, petrified roots of an ancient pine tree that protruded from the lower edge of the debris plug 30 feet above. Ignoring the agonizing tear in his right shoulder, he began to climb the chimney wall. The heat was agonizing. 130 degrees Fahrenheit. His lungs felt like they were bleeding. Every drop of condensation that hit his neck felt like a wasp sting. 10 feet up, the steam was thicker here, blinding him. 20 feet up, he couldn't breathe. His vision was tunneling into darkness. His right arm was entirely numb, operating on pure, desperate adrenaline. 25 feet up, he wedged his body into a small crevice between two massive boulders locked in the ice plug. Suddenly, the burning stopped. He gasped, drawing in a massive lungful of air. It was freezing cold. It tasted like snow and pine needles. He had breached the thermal boundary. He was wedged right against the microscopic cracks of the debris plug, where the Arctic wind from the outside world was slicing through, creating a tiny, localized pocket of clean, freezing air. Below him, the cavern was an inferno of boiling acid, roaring like a dragon. Caleb clung to the icy rock, suspended 30 feet above a boiling hell, breathing in the freezing storm. He had escaped the heat, but he was pinned against the ice, unable to move, unable to descend, while the mountain below him dissolved itself in rage. For 4 agonizing hours, Caleb hung suspended between 2 lethal extremes. Below his waist, the ambient temperature hovered near a blistering 110 degrees, the acidic steam banking off the lower walls and threatening to poach his legs inside his heavy trousers. Above his chest, where he was wedged into the microscopic crevices of the ancient debris plug, the punishing 20-degree draft from the surface acted as a localized cryogenic freeze. His body was a battleground of thermodynamics. The eruption of the devil's spit showed no signs of abating. The roar was a continuous, deafening low-frequency vibration that rattled Caleb's teeth and blurred his vision. Every time he shifted his weight, the acid-pitted nylon of his jacket tore a little more, the fabric turning brittle and useless. He could feel the chemical burns mapping their way across his exposed cheeks and neck, stinging like a swarm of angry wasps. But as the 5th hour approached, the violent rumbling began to stutter. The geyser had expended its immense pressure. The roaring hiss slowly downgraded to a wet, heavy gargle, and finally, to a sullen hiss. The thick white clouds of vapor began to thin, descending back into the lower tunnels as the cavern's internal draft re-established itself. Caleb did not move immediately. His right shoulder was locked in a spasm of sheer agony, the strained rotator cuff stiffening in the cold. He looked down into the high chimney. The steam was gone, but the walls were weeping a thick, yellowish slurry. The sulfuric acid had condensed on the limestone, aggressively eating into the rock. The climb down was not just perilous, it was structurally impossible. The handholds he had used earlier were likely dissolving into chalk. Furthermore, the 87-degree fortress he had painstakingly built was gone. Even if the floor held against the surging magma chamber, the air in the main cavern would be saturated with lethal concentrations of hydrogen sulfide for weeks. He could never go back. He had to go up. Caleb tipped his head back, shining his fading crank flashlight onto the debris plug blocking the chimney's exit. What he saw made his blood run cold. The plug, a century-old mixture of massive granite boulders, shattered pine trunks, and hardened permafrost, had been subjected to 4 hours of superheated steam. The thermal shock was catastrophic. The permafrost that acted as the mortar holding the massive stones together had melted into a thick, dripping black mud. "It's going to collapse," Caleb realized, his engineering mind instantly calculating the shifting load paths above him. The rapid expansion of the ice turning to water, combined with the sudden temperature drop as the geysers subsided, was causing the rocks to contract and slip. He could hear it, a sickening, wet grinding sound echoing from the heart of the plug. If that matrix of boulders gave way, millions of pounds of rock and mud would funnel down the chimney, crushing him into paste. He unclipped the folding titanium shovel from his pack with trembling, raw fingers. He couldn't just dig blindly. He had to treat the debris plug like a failing masonry arch. He studied the underbelly of the plug. 2 massive, jagged granite slabs were acting as the primary load-bearing corbels, pinching a cluster of smaller rocks and a thick, petrified tree trunk in the center. The mud around the tree trunk was flowing the fastest, weakening the central compression ring. "Transfer the load," Caleb whispered to himself, his voice sounding like dry leaves. He positioned himself directly beneath the petrified trunk. Using the serrated edge of his titanium shovel, he began to furiously scrape away the melting mud and loose gravel packed around it. Mud rained down on his face, blinding him, filling his mouth with the taste of ancient dirt and sulfur. He had to force a localized, controlled failure. If he could dislodge the central cluster of smaller rocks without disturbing the 2 massive granite corbels, he could create a narrow vertical birth canal through the plug. He wedged the blade of the shovel behind a basketball-sized stone, resting precariously against the petrified wood. He took a deep breath of the freezing air, closed his eyes, and leaned his entire body weight onto the handle, using it as a lever. The titanium shaft bowed, threatening to snap. Caleb screamed, ignoring the blinding pain in his right shoulder, and pushed harder. With a wet shuck, the stone dislodged. A torrent of black mud, icy water, and fist-sized rocks cascaded down, hammering against Caleb's shoulders and helmetless head. He pressed himself flat against the chimney wall, shielding his face with his arms as the debris rained past him into the abyss below. When the cascade finally stopped, he looked up. A ragged hole, barely 2 feet wide, had opened up alongside the petrified trunk, and at the top of that hole, Piercing through the eternal darkness of the cave was a single, brilliant beam of silver light. Moonlight. A ragged, half-sobbing laugh tore from Caleb's throat. He shoved his shovel back into his pack and began to climb. He squeezed into the narrow, muddy channel, the jagged rocks, tearing at his ruined jacket and his ribs. He wiggled like a worm escaping the earth, pushing upward through the freezing mud. His hands broke through the surface crust first. He felt the impossibly soft, dry touch of fresh powder snow. He clawed at it, hauling his battered, starved body out of the high chimney and collapsing onto the surface of the mountain. He was out. He lay on his back in the snow, staring up at the vast, uncaring expanse of the Montana night sky. The stars were blindingly bright, diamond dust scattered across a canvas of absolute black. He had survived the earth. Now, he had to survive the sky. The transition from the 87-degree geothermal womb to the brutal reality of the Bitterroot surface was a physiological shock that nearly stopped Caleb's heart. The blizzard that had buried him months ago had passed, leaving behind a crystalline, frozen wasteland. But the ambient temperature on the exposed ridge was easily 20 degrees below zero. The sweat and condensation that soaked Caleb's base layers began to flash freeze almost instantly, turning his clothing into a stiff, icy armor. He forced himself to his feet. His legs, weakened by weeks of near starvation and the agonizing climb, shook uncontrollably. He looked down at himself in the moonlight. He was a terrifying sight. His jacket was melted and pitted with acid holes. His exposed skin was mapped with angry red chemical burns. He had lost nearly 40 pounds, his cheekbones sharp enough to cast deep shadows on his face. To stay on the ridge was to die in minutes. He had to descend, find the tree line, and hope to God he stumbled across a logging road before his core temperature plummeted past the point of no return. He picked a bearing, keeping the constellation of Orion over his left shoulder to maintain a steady eastward heading, and began to walk. The snow was waist-deep powder. Every step required a monumental expenditure of calories he did not have. He waded through the white ocean, lifting his knees high, dragging his boots. Within 20 minutes, the violent shivering started the body's desperate, automatic attempt to generate heat. "Keep moving, Caleb. Heat is motion. Motion is life," he repeated the mantra in his head, matching it to the crunch of his boots. As the hours dragged on, the insidious apathy of hypothermia began to creep in. The shivering slowed. A deceptive, warm numbness spread through his limbs. The voices returned, louder this time. He saw Richard Sterling walking beside him on the snowpack, wearing a tailored Italian overcoat, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Look at you, Caleb," the hallucination of the architect sneered. "You survived the cave just to die in the snow. Typical. You always over-engineer the foundation, but fail to account for the environmental envelope. You're a structural failure." "Shut up," Caleb slurred, his lips numb and clumsy. "I engineered a hypocaust. I utilized geothermal mass. You would have suffocated on day one. And yet, I'm drinking Kenyan roast, and you are freezing to death." Caleb swung a clumsy, frozen fist at the hallucination. The momentum threw him off balance. He tripped over a submerged, snow-covered log and pitched forward, tumbling face first into a steep ravine. He fell for 50 feet, a chaotic blur of white snow, snapping branches, and blinding pain as his injured shoulders slammed against the frozen earth. He came to a violent halt at the bottom of the ravine, buried up to his chest in a drift. He lay there for a long time. The urge to close his eyes was overwhelming. The snow felt soft, almost warm. It would be so easy to just go to sleep. He had fought hard. He had beaten the avalanche. He had beaten the toxic gas. He had beaten the acid rain. Surely, it was okay to rest now. No. He remembered the 87-degree floor. He remembered the heat radiating into his bones. He remembered the sheer, triumphant thrill of forcing the mountain to keep him alive. He had not crawled out of the devil's spit just to become a frozen statistic. With a guttural roar, Caleb thrashed wildly, fighting his way out of the snowdrift. He dragged himself upright, clinging to the trunk of a massive Douglas fir. He looked around. The ravine had deposited him lower down the mountain, right at the edge of a vast, flat expanse of cleared timber. A clear cut, and running straight through the center of the clear cut Glowing faintly under the moonlight was a wide, flat ribbon of compacted snow. A logging road. Caleb stumbled toward it, falling, crawling, pushing himself up again. He reached the road and collapsed onto the compacted ice. It was easier to walk here, but his body was completely spent. His vision was tunneling, fading to black at the edges. Then he felt a vibration in the ice beneath his cheek. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, accompanied by the distinct, mechanical growl of a heavy diesel engine. Caleb pushed himself up onto his elbows. A mile down the road, two blindingly bright yellow halogen headlights cut through the darkness. A massive, rotating amber beacon flashed atop a towering cab. It was a county rotary snowplow, crawling up the logging road to clear the path for the morning timber crews. Caleb tried to shout, but his throat only produced a dry, croaking wheeze. He couldn't stand. He was lying directly in the path of the massive, spinning augers of the plow. He fumbled desperately with his stiff, frozen fingers, reaching into his tactical pack. He pulled out the crank flashlight. He gave it 10 frantic, spastic turns, the dynamo whining weakly. He held the flashlight up, pointing the dim, flickering LED beam directly at the approaching headlights. Click, click, click. The massive yellow machine continued its slow, inexorable advance. The roar of the diesel engine was deafening now. The spinning metal augers were less than 50 yards away, throwing massive arcs of snow into the trees. Caleb kept the light aimed, his thumb locked on the button, refusing to close his eyes. 30 yards. 20 yards. Suddenly, the roar of the diesel engine pitched down. The heavy air brakes hissed violently. The massive snow plow shuddered and ground to a halt, the spinning augers coming to rest less than 10 feet from Caleb's head. The heavy steel door of the cab swung open. A burly man in a high-visibility orange parka and a fur-lined trapper hat stepped out, holding a heavy maglite. Elias Dempsey, a 20-year veteran of the County Road Commission, shone his beam down onto the ice. What he saw made him drop his thermos of coffee. Lying on the road was a man who looked like he had crawled out of a post-apocalyptic nightmare. His clothes were melted, his skin was burned, his face was gaunt and skeletal. But the man was looking right at him, a fierce, unbreakable light burning in his sunken eyes. "Good God Almighty," Elias breathed, rushing forward. "Where the hell did you come from?" Caleb's cracked lips curled into a faint, grim smile. He lowered his flashlight. "Underground," Caleb whispered, before the darkness finally rushed in to claim him. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Missoula General Hospital Intensive Care Unit were a stark contrast to the eternal twilight of the cavern. Caleb lay in a bed, surrounded by a quiet symphony of beeping monitors, an IV line pumping warm, vital fluids and high-dose antibiotics into his emaciated arm. Both of his hands were heavily bandaged, treated for severe chemical burns and frostbite. He had slept for 36 hours straight. When he finally opened his eyes, he found two men standing at the foot of his bed. One was Dr. Samuel Arris, the lead trauma surgeon, holding a thick metal clipboard and looking at Caleb with an expression caught between professional medical curiosity and sheer disbelief. The other was Sheriff Wyatt Gable, an imposing man with a thick gray mustache and a skeptical squint. "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Arris said, adjusting his glasses. "You are, medically speaking, a statistical impossibility. Severe caloric deficit, first and second degree chemical burns, acute respiratory distress from sulfur inhalation, and profound hypothermia. And yet, your core organs did not shut down." Sheriff Gable stepped forward, pulling a small notepad from his breast pocket. "We found your truck at the trailhead back in November, Caleb. We flew search grids for a week. The Avalanche dogs didn't find a damn thing. You've been missing for 74 days. Out there, in the worst winter this county has seen in 50 years. The sheriff leaned over the bed. "Now, Elias Dempsey says you were wearing a melted nylon windbreaker when he found you. So, I'm going to ask you a very simple question, son. How the hell did you not freeze to death?" Caleb looked at the sheriff. His throat was raw, but his mind was crystal clear. The fog of hunger and panic was gone. "I built a hypocaust," Caleb rasped. The sheriff frowned. "A what?" "A raised floor. Ancient Roman engineering," Caleb explained, his voice gaining a fraction of its old, confident cadence. I found a geothermal vent in a limestone cave system. The hot spring was venting toxic hydrogen sulfide. If I stayed near it, I suffocated. If I stayed away, I froze. So, I dug a trench, built a raised shale floor, sealed it with clay and bone ash, and used the natural draft of the cave to pull the hot air under my living space and vent the gas through a high chimney. He looked Dr. Eris directly in the eye. It stayed 87 degrees all winter. I didn't need firewood. The earth heated the stone. Sheriff Gable stared at him for a long, silent moment. He exchanged a glance with the doctor. It was clear what they were thinking. Trauma-induced psychosis. Hallucinations brought on by extreme hypothermia. Right, Sheriff Gable said slowly, closing his notepad. Well, you just rest up, Caleb. We're glad you're alive. They didn't believe him. Caleb didn't care. He knew what he had built. He knew the absolute, uncompromising truth of his engineering. It took 5 weeks for Caleb to regain enough strength to walk out of the hospital. During that time, the news of his miraculous survival broke. He became a local legend overnight, the man who survived the Bitterroot winter. Sarah called the hospital room twice. Caleb let the phone ring until the nurses unplugged it. He had spent his entire life building structures to please other people, trying to maintain relationships built on faulty foundations. The mountain had stripped all of that away. He had survived because he relied on himself, on his own intellect, and on the immutable laws of physics. He didn't need Sarah's pity, and he no longer cared about Richard Sterling's lies. In late May, when the snowpack finally melted and the logging roads became passable, the true vindication arrived. Dr. Eris, fascinated by Caleb's claims of chemical burns and sulfur inhalation, had contacted a geological survey team from the University of Montana. Led by a team of spelunkers, they tracked Caleb's path back up the mountain to the coordinates he provided. They found the high chimney first, the debris plug still heavily scarred by the thermal shock of the eruption. Rappelling down into the main cavern, they discovered a scene of geological violence. The Devil's Spit had collapsed inward, expanding the subterranean lake, the water still boiling and churning with sulfuric acid. But safely away from the acid pool, they found it. The university team photographed a perfectly engineered 10 by 10 raised platform built from heavy basalt and shale. The left side was fractured, shored up by a rusted iron chain and heavy igneous rock. The floor was plastered with a thick, hardened white mortar, made of clay and pulverized animal bone. Beneath the floor, a perfectly preserved trench ran directly toward the venting pool. And resting perfectly centered on the floor, baked dry by the residual heat of the earth, was a digital altimeter watch. The battery was dead, but it stood as a silent monument to human ingenuity. When the geological report was published, detailing the functional, improvised geothermal heating system that had kept a man alive at a sweltering 87 degrees while the world above froze, the engineering community took notice. Caleb Hayes wasn't a corporate failure. He was a master of structural survival. Caleb didn't return to Seattle. He bought a small, rugged piece of land on the edge of the Bitterroot Valley, right in the shadow of the mountains that had tried to kill him. He built a small, highly efficient cabin. He designed the foundation himself. He poured the concrete himself. He checked every load-bearing beam. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, when the Montana winds howled and the temperature dropped to 20 below zero, Caleb would stand on his porch, holding a cup of black coffee. He would look up at the jagged, snow-capped peaks, feeling the bite of the cold air against his scarred cheeks, and he would smile. He knew the secret of the rock. He knew the fire that slept beneath the ice. Caleb Hayes' harrowing 74-day ordeal in the Bitterroot Mountains stands as a profound testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of applied intellect. Thrust into an unforgiving frozen wasteland, where hypothermia kills in hours, Caleb did not succumb to panic. Instead, he weaponized his engineering background against nature's brutality. By constructing a functional Roman hypocaust in a toxic geothermal cave, he achieved the impossible. Surviving the deadly cold without a single match, turning a lethal environment into an 87-degree sanctuary. His journey from a disgraced, broken man to a legendary survivor illustrates that our greatest tools are not the supplies we carry, but the knowledge we possess. The mountain sought to crush, freeze, and dissolve him, But through sheer will and structural brilliance, Caleb Hayes proved that human ingenuity can force even the Earth itself to yield.